Hey everybody, Craig here. Welcome to Yes Have Some Podcast. A little something different. This is just a little bonus episode for all of our listeners out there. I sat down with writer and director and actor Corey Landis, who has worked for the past several years on a Masters of the Universe documentary called Toy Masters. Now, the documentary has not been released as of yet, but what he did was he released it as a 5-part podcast. And it's amazing. I found it, and it was enthralling. I absolutely loved it, and I wanted to talk to him. Everybody knows I'm new to the Masters of the Universe world, and it was an education listening to the podcast. So what I would suggest you do is before you listen to this interview, go and check out Toy Masters. It's 5 episodes. It's on iTunes, wherever you get podcasts, and after that, come back for the supplemental interview with Corey. Obviously, you don't have to do it in that order. You could listen to this interview. I think you guys will get a lot out of it. So I was really happy to talk to Corey and learn about the process of making the documentary, all of the turmoil at Mattel in the creation and the rights to Masters of the Universe. It's a great story. It needs to be told in movie form. They need to cast me as somebody. I'll play somebody. I'll play the guy, Roger Sweet. That's who I'm going to play. The guy who says he created He-Man. Did he? I don't know. You got to watch the, listen to the documentary, then listen to the interview, and you make those decisions. I can't do that for you. But thank you guys for tuning in for Yes Have Some bonus interview with Corey Landis coming up right now. Here we go. Corey Landis, the writer, producer, director of a podcast that I found by complete accident, which is always my favorite thing, Toy Masters. And anybody who listens to Yes Have Some knows that Masters of the Universe is a brand new world for me. So I immediately searched Masters of the Universe podcast. This is the first one I found. Listened to all 5 episodes. Corey Landis. Corey, man, how are you doing?
I'm well. Thank you for finding it and finding me and saying that you enjoyed it and for your very kind review. It's much appreciated. I'm glad that there are people out there that can stumble upon it. So it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance and chat with you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of funny. I mean, we Yes Have Some is we're still pretty niche focused. We talk a lot about toy collecting, a lot about Ghostbusters, Ninja Turtles, and so on and so on. But Masters of the Universe, just to kind of update, let me let you know where I'm at before we go any further. So I have no nostalgic ties to Masters of the Universe. I was born in 1984, so by time it kind of was running its course, I was just coming into discovering properties and TV shows and toys and things like that. But so it's all new to me, and I love learning about the history of it. But before we go down that road, why don't you just tell me a little bit about you, how you got involved? I mean, I know this was, from what I could tell, originally going to be a feature documentary, and now it's a podcast. So how'd you get started? What are your early memories of Masters, and just then cover 30 years? How'd you get here?
Okay, yeah, no problem. There'll be a big blank section in the middle, but we'll just hurdle over that. Cool. I mean, it was definitely the first kind of thing I remember just getting really, really into. It just hit at the right time, and I think I probably got my first action figure maybe before I'd even seen the animated show. And, once the animated show was on, that was sort of it, because, it was on for a half hour and sometimes an hour right when I got home from school. So it was, appointment viewing, and I would watch it every day. And that only sort of fuels, you wanting to get more toys and all that kind of stuff. So it was very much the first thing that I really, really got into. And the toys were just so great that, as opposed to sometimes you get into something by watching it and then the toys are available and the toys are just a little lackluster. It was almost the flip of that, where the toys were just so incredible. And it was also cool to see them animated in a show and everything. So I I was very much into it, and all my friends were into it. When I was a little kid, and I would got into it to a certain point, and it just sort of fell off because you grow up and you get into other stuff, and it was everything else at that time, Star Wars and so forth. And also, as the documentary and podcast indicated, it had a little bit of a, fall off. So kind of right when it was waning, so was my interest in it. But it was always this, thing that I always had in my past that I held dear and had a fondness for, and so forth. And so my sort of renewed interest came when I was working on some scripts with a buddy of mine, Roger Lay Jr. We became friends because he cast me in a film, and we realized that we had a lot in common and a lot of similar interests, and we just became fast friends and just enjoyed sharing notes and stories about, just all sorts of comic book stuff and genre stuff and sci-fi and nerdy stuff, and all the way into comedy with, Letterman and all that kind of stuff. And, and so we were both in between, projects, which is a euphemism for hopelessly unemployed and no prospects. And so we were like, well, let's write some scripts. So we were writing some scripts, and during all that, we just would always talk about all of this other stuff. And at one point, he mentioned this book. And he said, well, have you ever read this book called Mastering the Universe? And I was like, no. He's like, oh, you got to read it. It's this great book by one of the guys who created He-Man. And it goes into all this detail, and it's a fascinating read that you have to read. And so I took it home and I read it, and I came back and I said, has anybody done anything on this? And we did some research, and we found out that nobody had done any sort of documentary material about the story and about the history of the toy line and all that kind of stuff. And I was just like, well, I mean, not for nothing, if we're looking for something to do, if nobody's done this, it might be something to think about. And I didn't really think it would go anywhere, but Roger had some experience with documenting things. He shot a movie called 95 Miles to Go, which is a documentary about Ray Romano going back on the road doing stand-up after he had been off the road doing Raymond. And he also had done some other documentary kind of stuff. And he had the equipment. And he was the one who said, that thing that you mentioned that we should do, we're doing it. I was like, okay. And then the next week it would be, all right, I've reached out to all these people and blah, blah, blah. And so it just started from there. And it just became a thing where, without any real purpose in mind other than documenting, talking to all of these people and all of the different permutations of the Masters toy line, we just would go out every weekend and talk to somebody new and just would film it. And then everything kind of went from there. But we really didn't have an idea of what we were doing and how it was going to come together. But it was just kind of like, well, if nobody's ever done this and nobody's talked to these people, at least we should go out and put this down, because, some of the folks are getting a little older and you never know what's going to happen. And so it just kind of went from there.
Cool. So, just doing a documentary is hard. Like it's obviously a ton of work. There's the different aspects of it, right? There's the actually doing all the interviews and all the producing and all of the, there's rights issues. There's so much that goes into it that people don't consider. So fast forward now, it's being released in podcast form, which I really liked because it was almost like a true crime podcast, but you're talking about Masters of the Universe, and it's 5 episodes, and it was very digestible, even, to somebody who isn't, I've got some level of being familiar with the brand. And obviously when you're around pop culture and nerd culture, like, you know, what you know. But I can't tell anybody enough to check it out if you have any interest in toys in general, and also just like 80s corporate culture.
Yes.
You know, this is very different than something, and I'm going to reference Ghostbusters a lot because it's the only thing I know anything about. But when
feel free, you're in a friendly house, so go for it.
So when you think about Ghostbusters as a concept, that is, you know, Dan Aykroyd, Harold Ramis, Ivan Reitman. They've created this thing. It's theirs. There's no question about, you know, who the originators were. But with He-Man and Masters of the Universe, and this is kind of what you really touch on the podcast, there's this whole basically war of words between multiple people over the years of, you know, whose idea it was and who created it and who created what characters and who should get proper credit. And it's just fascinating to hear, you know, a lot of times as people get older, they soften their stances and they make amends, but you really do a lot of focus on this between Roger Sweet and Mark Taylor, if I'm correct on those two names, who are kind of you know, as the podcast unfolds, they're kind of your two main characters. And they both really stand their ground and for better or worse, believe what they say is the gospel when it comes to who created Masters of the Universe. And it's just fascinating. So I can't imagine what it was like to be there for these interviews, and you're just capturing gold.
Yeah, it was. It was pretty freaky at times, and always interesting. And I mean, we went very much back and forth. We interviewed Roger first. We flew up to the Seattle area to talk to him, and we spent a lot of time with him. And then we talked to Mark Taylor, and then we got a chance when Roger Sweet was visiting his brother in LA to do another interview with him where we sort of played some stuff that Mark Taylor said to give him a chance to rebut it. And then we went back and talked to Mark Taylor about the things that he said. And you know, it was really wild because everybody's very convincing. And when you listen to them and you like them as people, you just believe what they say. And then with every new interview, we had to kind of go like, well, we thought we knew what was going on. Now, maybe we don't. And we just kept flip-flopping back and forth, which is something that I wanted to sort of do in the documentary and the podcast, to sort of take everybody on that journey of just when you think you kind of have your mind made up, then new information comes up, or there's a new sort of, way of looking at things. And it was, when there were, several moments, when we were playing stuff for Roger Sweet that Mark Taylor had said, and Roger Sweet's just sort of, flipping his lid, and, just watching his reaction to things and just making sure that it was captured. It was just like you said, it's just like you felt there was some real gold there. And then, talking to Mark Taylor and his good friend Ted Mayer, who also worked on the toy line, afterward, we kept the cameras rolling after the interview was over, because why not? Because they started talking a little bit more casually about everything. And it's just like, let's keep this rolling. Oh, this is really, really good off the cuff stuff. And there was just this feeling in certain times of the interviews where it was very interesting to see people just be themselves and have it captured. And it got wacky with Roger Sweet, because at a certain point, after we had already flown to see him and he knew what we were doing, and he gave us like a 3-hour interview, and then we met up with him in LA later. Like I told you, it came time for the formality of him signing the release form, which is just a basic thing that says that, you're aware that a camera is rolling and that it's going to be used in a documentary. And all of a sudden he refused to sign the release form.
Right.
And, and it was very much like that a lot of times where it's just like, just people behaving very strangely and just wondering whether this is ever going to happen. And, yeah, it was a very, very interesting filming process.
Yeah, and that's what I really like about the pod, because you do capture that. It's not just the interviews. You kind of interject with little anecdotes about, what was actually happening back and forth, prior to the interview, after the interview. And I think maybe, you even mentioned some of that stuff about like the waiver and
I could have. Yeah, that was, I wanted to, in the podcast gave an opportunity to sort of editorialize a little bit more. All the audio from everything was taken from the documentary, but the podcast, I kind of thought like, I can kind of interject a little bit more of the backstage stories.
It's funny you mentioned the kind of showing the reactions, or I'm sorry, capturing the reactions based on like what the other guy said, because I don't know if you watched that The Last Dance, which was the Michael Jordan documentary this year. And that's one thing they would do, where they would have an interview with, another basketball player, Isaiah Thomas, and they would show his comments to Michael Jordan and film it and then get his like live response. And I was like, man, more documentaries should do this, because, you've got, who knows when the last time Mark Taylor and Roger Sweet actually, talked was. So
exactly.
to kind of, you're kind of seeing that human emotion come out, like, oh, these guys, this goes beyond who created what. There's some bad blood there.
Absolutely.
And I guess we can, I want all of our listeners to go chat. I don't want to give away everything, and everybody's got to come to their own conclusions on, what folks' motivations are and why they are the way they are. I guess that's what we're always trying to figure out in the world, is why people are the way they are.
Yes.
But with Masters of the Universe, it just has such a it's an incredible fan base from what I'm learning, and it's really rooted in the toys, which is so interesting to me, because with something like Ghostbusters, Ninja Turtles, Star Wars, there's a lot of different facets to the you might like just the movies, or you like building the props, or you collect the toys or whatever. But like He-Man, it kind of, the toys are equally as important as the animated series, and it's kind of like a 50-50 split. So
for sure.
And that's what also makes it funny, is like, as a collector, when you're talking to these guys who created a toy line 30 years ago, the world's a lot different now than it was back then, and it's just kind of an amazing thing to witness. So I guess all I'm saying is thanks for doing it. That's what I'm telling you.
Well, yeah, no, it's I just, what you were mentioning before about how, you really didn't have a knowledge base of it. And that was something that was important to me as we were really getting down to the nitty gritty of making it, was that I wanted it to be accessible to people who didn't really know anything about it. I wanted them to be able to watch the thing and not think that this was just some sort of fan film about, obscure trivia and all that kind of stuff. Because in the end, a great, or let's say a good documentary, is one that anybody can sit down and watch, whether they have any knowledge about it before, and just get into the story. And the thing about the story that we're sort of telling in the Toy Masters documentary and podcast is, it's really not about toys. It's not about He-Man. It's not about any of that stuff. It's about, like you said, corporations, about hierarchy, about art versus commerce. It's about all of these other things, about human nature, about strange peccadillos that people have and won't let go of. It's not really about the toys at all. That's just sort of the artifice that sort of holds up the story that's being told. But it's the same story that gets told over and over and over again. It just happens to be set in the 80s, and it's at a toy company. But
right.
It's just so much more than that.
And I have a feeling that there are different versions of this story. When you work for a toy company, you're just working for Mattel. and you work on all these different product lines. Maybe you work on, Barbie or Hot Wheels or whatever, but this was the creation of, a property that has gone on to generate, millions and millions of dollars for a period of 30 or 40 years. You kind of get that feeling that these guys put the work in, and credit's great, legacy's great, but you kind of get the vibe that, money is also a motivator. And you really can't blame people, because if this is your thing that you worked on, and there's, somebody's making a lot of money off of it, and it's not you. I imagine bitterness and resentment just, I don't think that's exclusive to Masters of the Universe. Like, I'm sure exactly. Whoever designed the cover art for, the first Mario Brothers game, or there's probably just a lot of different versions of this story.
There's tons of like, I just heard something recently on a podcast about how the woman who did the voice of E.T. got paid like $300 for her session, and it's insane to think about. And so on one hand you go, well, that's the deal you signed. Right. And then on the other hand, you go like, well, maybe you should kind of do a Lucas thing and kind of offer up different points in the back end as a thank you. And the toy industry is just not going to do that, Right. So a lot of these people feel burned.
Well, because, the margins in the toy industry are so small, and, anything you watch about toys, and especially the creation of a line, it's always funny. We hear collectors and fans like, why are there re-releases? Why are there repacks? Why are they using the same tooling? It's like, it's because
it's so expensive.
It's so expensive. Yeah. Are you a collector? Are you a toy collector yourself?
Yeah, I would say I am. Yeah, I have, my house is, I don't want to use the term littered, but let's say decorated with tchotchkes of a variety of subjects and natures. I've got tons of action figures that are still in their packaging in my garage that I haven't had a place to display. But yeah, I'm very much into gathering things and displaying them, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we live for over here. That's a major part of our motivation to get up in the morning. We love collecting. We love all these different toy lines. And it's interesting with Masters, because this kind of goes back into where maybe some of that resentment and some of that stress comes from those original creators, is that they've, Masters of the Universe Classics was a big deal when they relaunched it in like 08, 09. And now they're about to do another relaunch with the Origins line, and all of that's based on the original stuff. So, I'm sure.
Yeah, and all those people who designed that stuff never had any idea that it would resurface 40 years later. And it's got to be strange and a little rankling to see toys on shelves for something that maybe you designed that long ago that you'd forgotten about. Now all of a sudden somebody's making money off of it. It's a bizarre notion.
Yeah. And I do want to say, I mean, obviously that stuff is part of the series of the podcast, but you guys really went into detail on the the brainstorming sessions and what kind of led to it, all the stuff from kind of starting off with the concepts of Conan and, how who was putting their heads together to do which builds, and all the stuff with, the animated series kind of being its own thing. And then you into some good detail on the movie, which all of that was new and fascinating to me. To me, the Masters of the Universe movie, the only thing I've ever known about it was, I don't think it's a lot like the cartoon, and I know it's got a cult following and isn't very good. So I actually, after listening to your episode, I watched the movie for the first time in my life. So it was like a good companion piece for me.
What did you think?
It's man, I think its heart was probably in the right place. I mean, obviously it's just one of those things where as soon as they leave Eternia and come to Earth, you're like, this is off the rails already. But Dolph Lundgren wasn't very great, but there's some really fun stuff in there. Like there's some, there's I don't know. I mean, I thought Skeletor Frank Langella was great. Like he took it very seriously, obviously. But just knowing like the story you guys go over with, the budget kind of falling apart at the end and then pulling the plug and really having to scrape together the end of the movie. Knowing that in the back of my mind as I watched it kind of gave a I don't know if I should have maybe watched the movie first and then listened to the story, because I was like, oh, this is why this looks the way it does.
Yeah. And again, it's sort of like an example of how so many things wind up as you watch this thing. And, even when I was a kid, I didn't really enjoy the movie. And you watch it and you just go like, well, this is a mess and it could have been so much more. And then you understand everything that led to that. And then you can go like, oh, I sort of get it. And maybe actually this is a whole lot better than it actually should be, considering everything involved. Everybody who was involved in it was, they were trying to do the best job that they could. And they got some really, really great, talented people involved. Right. And you go like, well, all right, well, Mattel made a crappy deal to begin with. And then you got, the Canon guys, and everything's falling apart. And, so when you see the director interviewed, there's a bit of cheerful defensive-ness, and you can understand why, because I'm sure he's just heard over the years how this thing is just not that great. And he's just like, you don't know. It's right. Kind of like the guy in Tim Burton's Batman who just reconstructed him. He's like, Mr. Napier, you see what I have to work with here.
Right. Yeah, exactly. As he's pulling the tape off, going like, we did the best we could. Well, I think like what it reminded me of was the Super Mario Brothers movie with Bob Hoskins. Yeah, which is kind of a favorite of mine. That would be that's the comparison I came up with, where I remember seeing that as a kid and going, well, I can't articulate what my feelings are because I don't know yet, but I know that was not what I was expecting. A buddy of mine, Ryan, said I think he may be a year or two older than me, and he was a big Masters fan, and he told me recently that that's the first time he ever remembers like leaving a movie theater and being disappointed. And when you're like 6 years old, that happened to me. I was a little bit older, but I think Batman and Robin,
Lord,
not Batman Forever. I'm a defender of that movie, but Batman and Robin.
Yeah, Batman and Robin is one of the single worst viewing experiences I've ever had in the theater. I was just like, what the hell did I just watch? I just felt like I'd been eye raped.
Yeah. And I feel like I had watched, I think that came out around the same time as Dirty Work. And I saw Dirty Work in theater. It was like a joyous experience. And then I saw Batman and Robin, just was like, oh, this, and I was old enough to know like that sucked. Like that was one of my early, like that sucked moments.
And something that one has to go through and move beyond. It's an important thing to have to go into something that you're just so excited about, and because it's like it's like the Phantom Menace syndrome. I just remember at the end of episode 1 that everybody was so afraid to say how much it sucked, like in the theater. It was kind of giving everybody else the side eye, like, are you going to be the one that voices that this is not good? And everybody's like, yeah, woo! It's like, all right. But it's an important thing to kind of come out on the other end of something and go like, I admit it. That was very disappointing.
Right. And it's funny. We started our podcast in, there's normally 3 of us, but sometimes the 3-on-1 interviews can be a little bit difficult. So I'm just doing the 1-on-1 tonight. But, we started our podcast in 2016 as a reaction to all of the negativity surrounding the new Ghostbusters movie that was going to come out, the Paul Feig movie. Mm-hmm. And because there was just so much negativity, so much sexism and chatter. And we were like, well, let's be a beacon of positivity. Let's be open-minded and let's do this. And then it took us till about a year after that movie was out to where we finally were like, okay, maybe it wasn't great.
Right.
Like, but you kind of have to, it's almost like a grieving process when you're that big of a fan of something. But it's interesting with a property like Masters of the Universe, because it wasn't too long after that, the first Ninja Turtles movie came out and is fantastic.
Yeah. I saw that in the theater, of course. I had the poster on my wall. I just remember my dad was nice enough to take me to it, and I was so stoked after seeing it, and I was just jazzed, and I wanted him to like it so bad too. And I was like, hey, wasn't that great? And I just remember him saying, that was entertaining. And I was like, that's a really nice, magnanimous response. You could have said it sucked donkeys, but you said it was entertaining, and that's a fair response.
That's fair from a parent. Like, at least he took you.
Yeah.
At least he took you. That's kind of the interesting process when you're such a fan of a property, especially when it's tied to stuff that was happening when you were a kid. And that's why I prefaced our conversation by saying I don't have a nostalgia for Masters of the Universe. So it's all new to me. So I can't imagine what it's like to be a lifelong fan of the property and to go through the ups and downs, because like all of these, you mentioned Star Wars. I'm a big Star Wars fan, and that's the definition of ups and downs.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah. So where do you go from here now that the podcast is out and people are listening to it? I'll just keep plugging away. Toy Masters, it's on iTunes. Download it, leave a review, do all that stuff, because you guys deserve it. What is this project? Is it done, or is there more to it, or what's your next step?
I don't have anything in mind per se. I came up with this idea out of one time on my hands and frustration that I felt that we had something good that I kept hearing about people wanting to see and sharing in my frustration that it wasn't out. And I just thought, like, well, I might as well do something with it. And so it was just kind of a last ditch effort to get the content at least out there in some form. I don't know.
Sorry to interrupt, but no. I just out of curiosity, because I don't know. Excuse me. What was the thing that ultimately prevented it from being able to be released in its original intended form?
Oh boy.
Or is that a separate podcast?
I was going to say that's a whole separate podcast. I don't even know how to answer that question succinctly. I would say, the movie is done, and I'm very, very proud of it, and I'll send you a link to it, and you can watch it if you're interested.
Absolutely.
But it's something. It's one of the proudest things, that I've done. I'm really, really proud of it. Really, really happy with it, and so it's not for lack of wanting to get it out there. It just gets complicated when one, you're doing this for the first time, and you're doing it with a very small group of people, and personalities get in the way, and different sort of notions of how things should go in the end get in the way that you really didn't discuss from the beginning, because you sort of assume that you're all on the same page, and then all of a sudden it's completed, and maybe some people will go, well, I think we should do this, and I think it should go like this, and we should, and then it's if you don't have everybody on the same page and it's not unanimous, you can't really do anything.
Right. It's hard to move forward.
Yeah. And and it becomes a legal thing as well, because, if you put something out that somebody worked on and they're not signing off on it, then they can possibly come after you. So,
right.
I can't even begin to start the stories about the ups and downs of the process of trying to get it out. And it has nothing to do with the external world. It has nothing to do with rights or Mattel or licensing or anything. It all has to do with, very much like the documentary, which there should be a documentary, or should have been a documentary about the making of this documentary. It's just all people. It's all people.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of why it hasn't seen the light of day. It still may. I don't know, but that would involve a whole lot of people just acquiescing and loosening up a little bit. So,
right. Well, yeah, not to tease the audience, but I'd love to check it out. But, I do think the podcast format worked because you guys were able to, like you said, you kind of editorialize it a little bit, give good context for the conversations, and we're all looking for content right now. So
Yeah.
yeah,
That's what I kind of figured. It's been on my to-do list for a little while, and then when this whole thing hit, I'm like, well, no time like the present, and everybody's just sitting at home, and I devour podcasts, and I just kind of thought it would be an appropriate time and an appropriate medium to kind of tell the story.
So as we kind of get closer to wrapping up here, I do want to ask you, you were fairly familiar. You read Roger Sweet's book. What was the most surprising thing? Is there's anything you learned or, took away from the experience making it, specifically related to Masters of the Universe that kind of surprised you or shocked you?
I guess, there were lots of little tidbits along the way that I thought were interesting and surprising and stuff that I didn't know. I would say the overall takeaway of something that was new, interesting, that I hadn't thought about, surprising, was just the way that Mattel handled everything. I kind of felt a very sort of middle-aged loss of innocence in just listening to these people at this toy company and how they just went about doing things, writing roughshod over so many other people and so many creative ideas, and just how the money aspect of everything just completely if that's all that you're interested in, you're bound to fail. And just thinking about how a multi-billion-dollar company can just behave like greedy buffoons was the biggest takeaway surprise that I had.
Yeah, it's always incredible to me when you really rely on the creatives to get the thing that whatever it is, whether it's a toy company or a technology company, you got to, you had people sitting in a room doing these designs, doing these, writing these backstories. And really you kind of backed into this, it's highlighted in the documentary, like Mattel had been trying to break into the boys action figure market for a while and it wasn't going well. So they kind of back into this He-Man universe, and then there's the animated series. Then the financials keep going up, where it's like the first year we made $7 million, and then 20, and then it gets into the hundreds of millions of dollars. It's always amazing when those same people who relied on the creatives to get them where they need to be start, like you said, overriding decisions and just making weird.
Boneheaded calls.
Yeah, boneheaded calls about, not just from a creative point of view, but like the way that the figures are distributed. And I don't know, maybe it's just because when you have that much success, it's really hard to imagine what it would be like. Like there's no way that we can go from 500 million to 3 million in 1 year. And like, that's what happened essentially. And part of it's just knowing the way that people's interests ebb and flow, especially in those formative years when you're like, obviously the target audience was boys, whatever ages 4 to 12. Star Wars was the biggest thing ever of all time and made more money than anything from a merchandising standpoint. And by 1985 or 86, kids didn't care anymore. So it's amazing that there wasn't any foresight and planning into, when you think about the overexposure and the...
they had no idea what they were doing. They just got dropped into it and then all of a sudden had to deal. And then when they had to deal, they suddenly have to pretend like they know what they're doing, which they didn't. I think it's summed up very well by Larry DiTilio, a writer in all the different animated shows, when he's talking about the reboot on Cartoon Network, where he says in season 2, he says if you have a success in the first season, in the second season, all of a sudden the toy companies think they know how to make a television show. And it's kind of like, any other, let's say, if you want to compare it to like a visual enterprise, like a television show. If you give an auteur a complete creative control over what they're doing, they come up with something, and all of a sudden it's a success, and they were left alone. All of a sudden, if it's a success, now all the network VPs are coming around offering notes on jokes and everything. And it's just like, well, first of all, you weren't here from the beginning. Second of all, you're not funny. And why don't you just let me do what I do? And right. I think that's very much what happened, at least in part with Masters, was that all of a sudden, they captured lightning in a bottle, and then all of a sudden they had to deal with it, and then they started pretending like they knew what they were doing.
Right. And the other thing that's interesting is, now everything, even like the new He-Man Origins line that's coming out, it's geared towards collectors. It's not, I don't know if kids,
no, of course,
but back then it was like, when you get to, 75, 80 characters deep, and some kid is 4 years old and he goes to the store and he can't find He-Man or Skeletor, that's a problem. So, I feel like toy companies have kind of wisened up to that, whether it's, wrestling figures or turtles or whatever, you can go down the toy aisle and get your main characters. But,
sure.
But from a collector's point of view, it kind of sucks because, we don't get the, long running extensive toy lines that run for 5 or 6 years where there's 300 figures and 40 vehicles or whatever. Like that just doesn't happen anymore because I'm not convinced kids even play with toys anymore. Like, I don't know. I don't know if it happens.
I know.
So, well, listen, Corey, man, thanks for joining. Anything else you wanted to cover or plug before we wrap up?
No, I just I appreciate having a nice conversation with you, and I appreciate that you found it and that you are talking about it, and it's been really nice. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, people have been giving me shit too because I do these things with toy collecting. We've got a private Facebook group for our podcasts where we've got 700-800 of us just talking toys all day long, and I make these proclamations, and I always said I would never collect Transformers or Masters of the Universe. My reasonings were very different. I thought to get into Masters of the Universe would just be too much of a financial endeavor. I just don't like Transformers. It's just never been my thing. If you gave me a Transformer, it looks like a foreign language to me. I don't know how to do it. It just doesn't interest me. I kind of don't care about those. But Masters, I was just like, it's too much because I know I'm not the kind of person, I can't just get a vintage He-Man and Skeletor and call it a day. It's going to be like, well, I got to get all the main characters.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest. I would say that it's a good opportunity for you to grow as a person.
I can't.
And just like feel what it's like to just dabble. Like, I like this guy, and just breathe and release and just know that it's okay. You don't have to have everything.
You know where I'm kicking myself is I actually, literally 2 weeks ago said, well, I'll get some of the Super 7, 5.5-inch figures and that'll be it. And then I immediately was like, well, let me start looking at Masters of the Universe Classics. Let me just check it out. And
I know.
So, Maddie Collector, we had what's his name? Scott Toy Guru.
Yeah.
We had him
Scott
on
Knightlick.
Scott Knightlick. Toy Guru is not his last name, but that's how I know him. We had him on our show last year to talk the Mattel Ghostbusters line, which was kind of happening simultaneously with the Masters of the Universe line. Obviously, the Masters line was much more successful, and but what shocked me was the aftermarket prices on those figures are insane.
It's insane. It's absolutely insane.
I mean, you've got, $20 and $30 figures that are now selling for $300-400, but
I know.
Hey, life of a collector. I could have picked a different hobby.
Indeed.
Well, listen, Corey, I'm going to point everybody in the direction of Toy Masters, and maybe down the road we can catch up a little bit and see what you're up to.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Craig, for all this. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Take care, man.
You as well.
Hey, everybody. Craig here. Thank you so much for checking out Yes Have Some this week. I wanted to tell you about the exclusive Yes Have Some audio content that you can get on our Patreon page. That's going to be patreon.com/yeshavesome. For $5 a month, you're going to be getting exclusive access to our weekly, we're doing weekly audio bonus content now, 15, 20, 25 minutes every week after the regular podcast drops. You can head over to Patreon, and it's going to be brand new discussion topics, things we're not covering on the main podcast feed, bonus fuck budgets, things that maybe we don't want to talk about on the main feed that we want to save for exclusive access to all of our Yes Have Some Patreon members. Now, it's only $5 a month, and that goes directly to the podcast for our hosting fees, our website costs, things like that. And we're going to be providing you extra audio content every single week, plus a monthly full bonus episode where we break down a movie or an old TV show. And we'll probably do more than that. So we're just kind of getting started with Patreon. We want to make sure that everybody gets a lot out of it. So head over to patreon.com/yeshavesome and sign up today. We appreciate the support. Now, back to the show.